book is Van Halen at 50, the author Martin Popoff. Martin, welcome back to the show.
Yes, thanks very much, Eric. Very cool chatting with you again.
Yeah, man, there it is. I'm just flashing it for those who are watching this episode. What a beautiful book. Van Halen at 50. That first milestone moment titled Sinner Swing, Van Halen is born. And you talk about how David Lee Roth with the brothers Edward and Alex in Pasadena, they eventually bring in Michael Anthony. And there's a picture of an album on that page, and it's an album by Cactus. And I know about this. For those who aren't so familiar with the Van Halen history, this is an interesting story. So Edward and Alex, they had some interesting influences growing up, and Cactus was one. What's interesting is the bands that the brothers are into and the bands that, and the artists that Dave was into. He's into R&B, Motown, funk. Ed and Al are into straight ahead rock and roll. And so here's my question. If that weren't the case, would Van Halen have been as successful and stand out the way they did, if not for that mix of influences? Was it important to add Dave's musical tastes?
That's an amazing question, but I expect that from a Van Halen expert like you.
Well, I'm going deep on these. Yeah, we're going to, the surface questions. Yeah, we're going to avoid.
That's actually really cool because I guess Dave then brings essentially the entertainment aspect and the fact that you have to please on record and with the crowd. And the Cactus it's really interesting you bring that up because Van Halen's basically coming up 73, 74. They don't get an album out till 78, but they're essentially, the funny thing is there's a parallel here with Iron Maiden and Metallica in that Iron Maiden and Metallica were the first two bands on album that gave you covers that you as a metal fan wanted to hear. Cool, obscure, excellent covers. Or what they would do sometimes is they would pick the one or two heavy songs from a band that wasn't particularly heavy, or they spotted the heaviness in the writing of a song and it was never heavy arranged on the record, and they would give you that kind of thing. So Van Halen is kind of interesting that way because Cactus and many of the other things they did kind of give you the history of hard rock, with the tacit explanation being there ain't much hard rock. And that's, when we talk about the history of heavy metal, and I got a whole book called Who Invented Heavy Metal, and that's a long story. But the funny part of the story is that in America, with Van Halen being such an inherently American band, in America, there really was a very scant history of heavy metal up until Montrose in 73, Aerosmith in 73, Kiss, New York Dolls, Ted Nugent going solo in 75. But before that, we kind of had Blue Cheer, MC5, Stooges. That's a whole different thing. That's like late 60s. But in the early 70s, all we had was leftover, warmed over British blues boom bands like Cactus and Mountain. So Van Halen are like DJs on stage. They love music, right? They love presenting music that they love. So also because of their American bent, they mine for anything decent from America to play for you live, like ZZ Top, good quality, heavy, complicated ZZ Top songs they would play as well. But they'd also play a little Budgie, a little Black Sabbath. They'd kind of go all over the place. Famously, I think it's just one Montrose song that they played live, even though they get compared to Montrose all the time. But yeah, it's interesting that the Cactus is there because basically these guys are coming up through that 73 to 78 period as complete music nerds. They know they have to entertain. So that's the Dave side, plus just the boogie hard rock side that you would get, covers that would be demanded to be played live, but they would also go pretty obscure and pretty deep as well. So we know going into this, these guys are music scholars.
You mentioned Blue Cheer, Michael Anthony. In fact, when Van Halen got inducted to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and it was only him and Sammy that showed up, but Mike brings up that in his speech that his sister showed him a Blue Cheer album, and that's what got him into rock and roll. Blue Cheer.
Yeah, and Blue Cheer, I always say, excuse me, I always say that Black Sabbath is the origins of heavy metal. February 13th, 1970. But there's a whole prehistory. And when I did that Who Invented Heavy Metal book, basically, I was Facebooking with someone the other day. It's 120,000 words. It ends in 1971, and I don't think 1970 even starts for like 160 pages or something. So there is this prehistory, and if you're going to go into the prehistory, you're basically going to, for full albums that invented heavy metal, everybody knew about Vincebus Eruptum. Vincebus Eruptum, yeah. And it actually is a San Francisco album too, which is interesting. So it's close by. It's a California album. But besides that, there's basically Jimi Hendrix and Cream. And for full albums, there's the first Blue Cheer, and then there's Outside Inside, which doesn't get enough credit. It's actually more modern than the first one, but it's the same year. It's actually still 1968. And then you've got Stooges 1, 69. You got Kick Out the Jam, 69. And that's it. That's it really for the preambles, the precursors to a very modern, different, heavy, doomy, the blues is taken out of it statement in Black Sabbath.
Kick Out the Jams, MC5. We just lost the last founding member of MC5?
Oh, I don't know if it's the last. I think who's left? We've lost now Rob Tyner, Wayne Kramer, and let's see, bass player, drummer Dennis. Dennis is still around, I think. Okay. Right? Yeah.
Oh well, no, that's who just passed.
Oh,
Dennis
okay.
Thompson.
We lost.
Here it is. The headline.
Fred Sonic Smith. So who is the last? There's 5 guys. Hang on. But yeah, they are. Yeah. I've interviewed those guys. Not Rob Tyner. He goes way back. But yeah, Kick Out the Jams. Super important. Pretty heavy album for 1969, right?
Yeah.
Early 69, because it's New Year's 68 that it gets recorded at the Grandy Ballroom, right?
Yeah. From Detroit, right? MC5.
Yep.
Gene Simmons, Paul Stanley, discovering Van Halen. That's another milestone, one of the 50 milestone moments in the book. Gene ends up producing a demo for the band, doesn't get them signed. Ultimately, it's teaming up with Ted Templeman, who helps get the band's live sound on tape, and they're signed to Warner Brothers. Have you listened to that Gene Simmons demo, and what do you think of it?
Yes, and they are more of a pedestrian band at that point. I would argue with you that they got their live sound on tape, because I have some distinct opinions about that album, that first album. But to me, what we see here is the story of the music industry, right? You could be great, you could be hyped, but the funny thing with Van Halen is that they almost didn't hit the zeitgeist. Well, they truly didn't hit the zeitgeist. They were like signed despite, because people would complain about David Lee Roth being a Jim Dandy, warmed over Jim Dandy guy, and that stuff's over. Hard rock's over. Looking like Jim Dandy is over. It's all about the new wave now. So Van Halen were almost seen as has-beens a little bit. So you see that people weren't chomping at the bit to get this band going. I mean, they're going to fit in because there's going to be a metal revival in the UK with the new wave of British heavy metal. There's going to be a big hair metal run from 1983 to about 1992 that Van Halen's going to be a precursor of. But they're essentially making music in a hard rock wilderness to start out with, sort of thing. 78 and 79 are notoriously, I remember growing up through those years, it felt like that was the first time that hard rock was under siege as being like a sort of has-been sort of music. Most of our hard rock heroes were breaking up or making lousy albums, or sometimes going poppy. You think of Derringer and Stars and Moxie and Aerosmith going away, No More Deep Purple, Black Sabbath breaking up and then reforming, kind of thing, with Ronnie James Dio. But yeah, so Ted Templeman comes in, and the interesting thing about that, it was a very belabored album, especially at the vocal end. And I don't think it is their live sound. I think what you get on that album is the most sober and conservative and meticulous recording those guys would ever do. I don't think we get Brown sound here. I think you get their live sound starting on Van Halen 2. Interesting.
So you don't feel it's overproduced or anything like that, though, for Van Halen?
I think it's amazingly, beautifully, perfectly, meticulously, conservatively produced. There's no odd tones on it anywhere. Everybody just sounds really, really good. It just sounds like a super expensive corporate excellently produced, molten, exciting album, but conservative.
Yeah, I asked that question, I guess, putting that Gene Simmons demo up against what Templeman did. So I'm kind of going off of that because the Gene Simmons one sounds more polished to me. It sounds a little bit more like almost like a Kiss record, the way it's produced. And then listening to what Templeman did, I think that's where
it's polished, but it's modest.
Yeah.
You know, and I think with Ted, like you hear those stories about him having to piece together the vocals and not having the other guys around and all that stuff because they'd probably fire him if they saw how hard it was getting vocals out of him, kind of thing, right? Because he was always on the edge there. But you know, credit to Ted for getting him through, and credit to Dave. You know, growing up and not seeing the band live, but you know, growing up in a small town in British Columbia, Canada, and just having the records, it never crossed our minds. We had no idea that it might have been somewhat of a struggle for Dave to sing. He sounded great. He sounded like he was leading that band. He sounded like an authority. He sounded like a wise old man with those vocals, because they're pretty masculine vocals that he comes up with, right?
Yeah, I love his vocals on those albums. Interesting point that you bring up in the book about how when you first was exposed to Van Halen, you viewed it from the point of view as a drummer. So Eruption, there's a lot of kids who were guitarists, jaws dropped, but you weren't really listening to that as much as you were listening to some other things on that first album.
You know, I can remember it like it was yesterday. Over at Forrest Hoop's house, the big Yamaha receiver, 150 watts a channel, beautiful ebony turntable, receiver was ebony, Bose 901s in his parents, you know, in the living room, carpet everywhere. And we played that album, and we actually approached it more as total heavy metal experts at 15 years old, right? So what we heard, I remember, this is my impression of that record, right? My impression of that record was there was some filler in like Feel Your Love Tonight. What weren't crazy about Running with the Devil or Jamie's Crying, weren't crazy about getting a Kinks cover, weren't crazy about getting Eruption, weren't crazy about getting Ice Cream Man. So all of a sudden, half the album is not that great. But the other half sounded like as good as the best European metal you can possibly imagine. To our ears was basically Judas Priest and Scorpions,
like On Fire and
yeah, On Fire,
Atomic Punk.
Yeah. I'm the One. Ain't Talking About Love. Basically, it reminded us a little bit of Queen in that there ain't that many great songs on here, but the ones that are heavy are heavier than anything out there. So it's almost like, yeah, you want us to try this? We'll like slay all comers if you ask us to try this, and they did. So it was literally like hearing Scorpions' Virgin Killer mixed with a Moxie album. There were some things that we thought were, this is kind of a little slow. Jamie's Crying is a little poppy and goofy. Run with the Devil's too slow. It's boring us to death. We're 15 years old, right? You know, I don't need to hear You Really Got Me done by anybody, even though it's heavy here. It's kind of cool. But so yeah, so that was the funny thing about it. We just thought the metal on it was some of the best metal we had ever heard, but we only liked half the album, you know, in a big way.
Did you appreciate the other songs as the years would go on? Looking back,
not particularly way more or anything. But yeah, I mean, years later, you realize, Running with the Devil, it's kind of cool. They're taking the foot off the gas. They're creating a mood or whatever. But it still doesn't. No, still to this day, it's the absolute headbangers on that album that I love the most.
Let's revisit that thought on Dave and his vocals and how Templeman had to work hard, and Dave had to work hard too. The first plan was Casablanca Records. That was Gene Simmons. He had hoped that they would get signed to Casablanca Records, but Bill Aucoin was saying he suggested that they replace Dave, and of course they didn't. So, and then there was this story that's been out there now quite a bit that Ted Templeman and Warner Brothers considered bringing in Sammy at the time because Ted worked with Sammy in Montrose, decided against it. So the big what if is, what if Sammy joins in 78 and not 85? How would things have panned out? How how would we be talking about Van Halen today if Sammy did join the band then?
Yeah, that's crazy. Who knows? You know, Sammy was a good looking guy. His hair was cool. He dressed a bit goofy, but they all did. So maybe
Wonderful teeth.
maybe he'd not be, yeah, maybe he'd not be dressing so cool. Maybe he'd be like one of the nerdiest looking guys in the band. But if they all got, you know, a hold of him and a hold of Mikey didn't dress very cool either in the early days, right? But who knows? I mean, great voice. I'm not crazy about his stage mannerisms back then. But we know Dave's an incredible showman. He looked amazing. He sung great. He was just a firecracker up there, explosive front man. So yeah, it's great that we got him. You know, and I just remember as a kid growing up thinking he was just the coolest guy ever. And I don't think I ever really thought that about Sammy Hagar. I mean, already in 1978, 79, 80, I knew all of those Sammy Hagar albums. You know, and to me, he was a little bit of like a heavier version of a Bryan Adams or a proto Night Ranger, kind of in that poppy hard rock, heartland, Rust Belt rock range, Midwest rock sort of sound, right? So we never thought he was super cool. So if he would have come into the band, although, you know, Street Machine, we you know, quite like that album coming up. But yeah, who knows what would have happened? I have a feeling, you know, if I really had to think about it and give like a correct answer, I would say they probably still would have been just fine because Sammy brings other things to the table.
Okay. Yeah, I my argument is that it was perfect timing as to when Dave was there and when Sammy was there. I think when Sammy joins, it's perfect timing, especially when you get into that era of rock, big rock ballads, which Sammy would eventually contribute to the band during his time. And I think that was huge in the late 80s. That became a big thing. And so you got When It's Love and Why Can't This Be Love and Dreams and those types of songs that, you know, that wouldn't have been the case if Dave was still there. I mean, they still would have been huge with Dave, but I just feel like if Sammy joined in the beginning, it would not have worked out as well as it did, as Dave being there when he was, Sammy joining when he joined.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So let's get into, actually, before we move past that first album, here's another what if. So what if you take, I'd love to do maybe it's online, take Van Halen 1, all the songs on Van Halen 1 and strip those kick-ass harmonies, right? The Mike and Ed harmonies. But what if you strip that from that album? How does that change the course of Van Halen history? Because I think about that Montrose album and how Templeman, he always said, I wish if we just had one hit single. Maybe that's what was missing from the Montrose album, is those harmonies. What would happen if you didn't have those harmonies?
Yeah. That's a really interesting point. I never really thought about that with the Montrose album.
Be an interesting experiment, right? To listen to it with no harmonies whatsoever. Just listen to them.
You are absolutely right. I mean, I do think that's a huge part of that album.
It's Beach Boys stuff, man. Yeah, it's like Beach Boys magic right there.
And again, just like, you know, as a metaphor for what I said about the production, it's kind of the same thing with the harmonies. If you think about it, they are the most conservative, ambitious, soberly, meticulously well put together on the debut than you get moving forward. Moving forward, you hear a little bit of that drunken looseness in it. You hear a little less, probably less tracks of them. They're there and they're great and we celebrate them, but they are no more cleaner and more pristinely done than they are on the debut.
Yeah, Women and Children First is where I feel that looseness start to kick in. That's for me. That's where I start to feel it. Yeah. Now, one of the sidebars in the book is interesting. It's on Eddie's famous two-hand tapping, and a lot has been written about the origins, who did it first, who inspired Eddie to try it himself. But what I like in your book is your write-up is talking about Ed's use of it. You know, that when he inserts it, like you say, it's more of a syllable or a word in his dictionary. Can you talk about that and the different examples of how he would vary it up, like in Jump or in Mine All Mine? Because that speaks to his overall songwriting skills, in my opinion, and how he would use it to elevate a song rather to be like, hey, look what I can do, which a lot of the 80s guitarists, look how fast I can play. Yeah. Ed chose where to put it and how to play it.
Yeah, it's a technique that had been done a few times before. We hear the stories about a little bit of Jimmy Page and a little bit of Billy Gibbons and Harvey Mandel and Steve Hackett. on record, and even Brian May. You know, and in 1978, although this is the Judas Priest made 2 albums in 1978, but you definitely hear a really good, solid, structured tapping on the second 1978 album. So technically speaking, it's what would that be? Something like 9 months later than the debut Van Halen album. But yeah, the point is that it doesn't matter who invented it, so to speak. It's like who took the ball and ran with it and made it just part of his lexicon, part of his vocabulary. So Eddie used it. Eddie used it as just something that spontaneously almost like came out of his mouth or came out of his fingers. It was almost like second nature. He used it as a bridging technique between riff sections or chordal things that he did. He used it as a bridging technique between more conventional guitar soloing. He could just slip in and out of that all the time effortlessly, kind of thing. And he had various types of tapping that he could do. So he was basically the guy that said, I want to explore this way further than anybody else. And he's absolutely the king of it. And then it got picked up by other guys and it never quite sounded the same because you put it together with everything else and, the quote unquote Brown sound, which I have some opinions on it as well. That he's just, even when he does it, it just sounds so uniquely him.
Yeah, the other guitarists of that era some did a great job. Vito Bratta, I always say, he's my favorite of the Eddie disciples. But a lot of times, and I'm not saying this about Vito, I don't know this. Obviously, I wasn't there when these albums were recorded. But it's almost like, hey, make sure we reach that quota of finger tapping. Let's make sure you get it at least a handful of songs on the, like. It's almost like it's paint by numbers. Like we got to get that in there because that's the sound. Whereas Eddie, I don't think any of it was planned. It just came to him. Yeah. Women and Children First. 1980, Fair Warning, 1981, 2 very interesting albums. The first 2 albums I always felt could be a double album, but I think you'd have a different opinion on that. Do you feel that way? I feel like those first
two. Yeah. Stylistically, I just never from the day I heard it thought the second album sounded anything like the first album. It just sounded so loose and The Who-like. I think that's when they start. To me, I did a podcast episode of my History in 5 Songs thing where it's like, I can't remember the title, but the concept was bands that sound like separate personalities, all playing in different corners of the room. And The Who is a great example of that. You've got a very distinct drummer, you've got a very distinct guitarist, you got a very distinct bass player, you've got 2 distinct singers, doing, and even their personalities are different. Van Halen to me was like a unified machine on the first album, but on the second album they start sounding like The Who to me. And you really sort of get that vibe. I think I guess I'm disagreeing with you a little because you think they go together, but when I hear the absolute shambling looseness of how they come into the album with the intro to You're No Good, that just shows something so different to me. It's like incredibly casual compared to anything on the debut, right? And then to me, that sort of sets the mood, and I feel that's kind of the deal as we go forward. Because DOA, you think of a song like DOA, right? Really simple, but it's all about the performance of that simple song. Just the weirdness of these players is starting to come out. Alex is not weird at all on the debut album. But he's starting to even sound weird on the second album. And I do think the harmonies, you hear them, they sound more human though. They sound less like a machine, Women in Love and stuff like that, right? You're starting to hear 2-3 distinct voices. It sounds like a bunch of high school kids, where on the debut, it just sounds super professional.
Yeah, I always found that interesting, the choice of a lead track on Van Halen 2 being You're No Good. Not a hard rocker, but instead that dark, ominous opening with the bass line from Mikey. I thought that was interesting. Now, Women and Children First, Fair Warning. Most hardcore Van Halen fans will say Fair Warning is the best, or certainly they would pick it over Women and Children First. Putting those 2 up against each other, which one would you choose?
Yeah, it's so funny when you get a bunch of Van Halen fans together, how hard it is to pick a favorite album by this band, right? I mean, everybody, there are literally 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 clear choices, and I often hear 5150 from time to time as well, right? But I find these records completely, well, pretty much different from each other. There's one way they're similar. I think the way that they're similar is that this is now an eccentric band who will try anything. They'll give you whatever kind of song. It can be very off the wall. So you get some off the wall songs on both albums. But I think Women and Children First is their noisiest, most chaotic, most Who like, most casual album. It's it sounds like anarchy to me. You think of Tora Tora or Loss of Control, especially, right?
Yeah.
Everybody wants some. I mean, there's so much just raw performance madness on that album. Yet Fair Warning is considered one where they worked on pretty hard to get everything right, and it sounds like it. And it's again more professional and more tight and more conservatively produced. And that's the one that's considered the one that Eddie spent the most time on, hours wise, kind of thing. So I find those records completely different from each other, except for the fact that they are weird people, and they will write some weird songs along the way.
Such an interesting time in Van Halen history. 1982's Diver Down included a handful of cover songs. It's been panned by many because of that. Fair or unfair? Is Diver Down overlooked?
Yeah, it's fair, and Eddie, it's credit to him for complaining about it and hating the idea of doing so many covers, because, he was a musician, he's a writer, he's a creative person, right? So that really bummed him out. No, it's not overlooked. I think it gets its just due, because it's short, just like all of them. So that's an annoying thing about it as well. I don't think the covers are particularly well done. I think Dancing in the Street is done in a very novel way, but I don't think Where Have All the Good Times Gone is so great. Pretty Woman's okay. I mean, it's Van Halenized at least. I don't think Hang 'Em High is a particularly amazing Van Halen song. So when you get down to the very few originals, I've still got complaints. Little Guitars, to me, is a masterpiece. I love that song to death. It's one of my favorite songs they ever did. But yeah, you got Big Bad Boys, Sweet William Now, and Happy Trails, and just a lot of goofing around, right? Which is fine in the CD age if you're going to give us a 70-minute album, but at 29 or 30 or whatever it is, it's like, no.
I listened to the stripped down Hang 'Em High where you hear just Alex's drums. That's a great performance by Al on drums on that song.
Yeah.
What's your opinion of Alex on drums during the Dave era and the Sammy era?
I
a lot of people said he got better with time.
Yeah, I would agree with that. It's kind of cool idea. So one thing, you're right. I mean, I think he gets more Alex-like, and he becomes more unique over time. But the thing I love a lot of things about Alex as a drummer, but what I love and what I tend to argue with people is that I think he's almost equally as much of the Brown sound as Eddie is, right? I mean, people just talk about the effects and the guitars and the fingers and the tone and all that that's supposed to be the Brown sound. I think the Brown sound is Alex and Eddie combined. I don't think there's anything Brown sound about the bass or the vocals. But what I love about Alex is, yeah, he gets more interesting and unique and obscure over time, but I think he gets more Brown sound over time. So I think I love the production on 5150, and I think it's pretty cool on OU812. But my favorite production of all the Van Halen stuff is It's About Time and Up for Breakfast. When you get up into that, those are so crushing and heavy and incredibly Brown sound. And I think Eddie's playing bass on both of those, pretty sure.
Yeah.
But yeah, I just love those two songs. And also they're like downwound, weird, casual Who like songs as well. They're like what I call underwritten songs, right? Or undercooked. But the performances are so incredible on it. That's one of the great magical things about Van Halen is the performances, right? Because the songwriting often isn't really there. Everybody Wants Some is barely written. Fools is barely written. These DOA is barely written. But what takes them over the top is Eddie and Alex and the backing vocals and Dave as a vocal, all of those guys working together take songs over the top, right? But yeah, I love Alex as a drummer. I love the double bass work, the double bass sound that he picks, the snare stuff, the constant shimmering, shining cymbals all over the place when he does that thing.
What he's doing during Eddie's solos, I just find fascinating. Nowadays, I really if you tune into what he's doing during Eddie's solos, you're blown away by what he's doing. They talked about it. Alan Ed talked about it in an interview maybe 10 years ago or so, just how there's that interplay between the two whenever Ed goes into the solo.
It just popped into my head is it's called In and Out, right? There's a song called In and Out.
Yeah, In and Out from
Unlawful Carnal Knowledge. So when he's doing that solo, the drums going on in the background are just thundering and Bonham like. They're just so cool. And he's doing these big bass drum drops and and what he does with the cymbals. So yeah, he can fall into just one of the most magnificent grooves that you can imagine.
You mentioned, I remember one time we talked about Van Halen, and you mentioned Why Can't This Be Love, not only being just a great pop song, but it's a smart song, musically smart. And I would say like Jump is that example too. Again, listen to what Al's doing during the solo in there. And you're hearing things that it's just not your standard straight ahead pop rock song. They're doing some things in there that are intricate and hey, preaching to the choir here. So
exactly. I really do not like most Van Halen ballads, and I don't think they are smart with the chord changes. They're maudlin, they're hair metal-y, don't like them at all. But Why Can't This Be Love is just the perfect example of how to write a pop ballad, I think, and make it smart and accessible at the same time. Please everybody, right? Please the music nerds, the clerk at the record store, and please the girls, kind of thing. It's just so cool the way that the chords shift around and it's up tempo and it's got buoyant, joyous drums on it and stuff. But they can write a lot of crap too. Like When Love Walks In, like those chords, listening to, it's just so it's just basically, Diane Warren, Marty Fredrickson, Mark Hudson, Aerosmith, Cheap Trick the Flame type stuff. I don't think they do a good job of it for a lot of those.
Can't Stop Loving You is one of those too, where like they even said to Eddie, we need a hit. It's like, okay, here you go. Here's your hit. Yeah. I hear what you're saying.
Chorus.
Yeah. So we know how huge 1984 was and still is. Jump, #1, Panama, Hot for Teacher, I'll Wait, all big singles.
Yeah.
I love Jump, but there are fans that were turned off by it, especially the ones who were older from the beginning, who were there when there were no keyboards. What was your initial reaction when you first heard Jump?
It's funny. Yeah, that's a great question because I remember hearing it either as an advanced single or didn't have the album yet and I heard it on the radio. Something like that.
Were you a journalist at that time?
No.
Okay, no.
That's literally that's 1984 and I didn't start till 93.
Ooh, okay.
So long time later. Basically, what I remember is that being an angry young metalhead, it was shocking, but I liked it. I thought it was daring and creative, and I was just taken up by the enthusiasm of it, the joyous drumming in it. Just I thought the Might As Well Jump line just went a little over the top. It was too on the nose about being giddy. But didn't really mind that keyboardiness to it. And then there was the guitar solo. The funny thing about that album is that I grew up for years kind of complaining about it. Again, still mad about them making short albums. And it was such a hit album and everybody loved it. And I just remember being into heavier stuff and blah, blah, blah. But now when I go back, see, when I have to pick a favorite Van Halen album, I'm like your typical, we're Van Halen fans are notorious for being big complainers and bellyachers about everything.
No.
Right? Yes.
Really?
Absolutely.
I say that sarcastically.
Yeah, I know. But the funny thing is, I find myself falling into that that domain when I try to pick my favorite Van Halen album, because all I can think about is the things I don't like about every Van Halen album, right? But the weird thing that happens is from time to time, I've called 1984 in recent years my favorite Van Halen album because Jump is great. Panama I never liked. To me, that is the epitome of the underwritten, undercooked Van Halen song. I just find it dull and casual. It sounds like a jam to me, right?
Yeah, it's one of their biggest. Yeah, it's
But I
interesting.
love Drop Dead Legs. I like Top Jimmy a lot. Hot for Teacher, I was never crazy about, because that's another complaint I have about Van Halen is when they try the OTT fast songs, there's an inhaling helium vibe about them where Eddie gets small and quiet and goes, and Get Up is like that as well. So when they do these, they never sound heavy. Their fastest songs do not sound heavy, right? Other bands do fast songs heavier. So something about Hot for Teacher just seemed too casual, too twee. But then the entire rest of the side are some of my favorite Van Halen songs. I love I'll Wait. Girl Gone Bad is absolutely top five for me. Always
House
has
of
been.
Pain.
And House of Pain's great. So when I look at that and I go, all right, they gave us 4 songs plus 1984 intro. And I look at all 8 songs, 4 on each side, and I'm going, I really quite like 6 of these, and that's almost like a better hit rate than most Van Halen albums for me. So I love it. And again, I think this is probably the greatest chemistry they ever had. Between those 4 players playing off of each other in a jazz-like way. I think this is just the best of those guys firing on all 6, especially on something like Girl Gone Bad.
You get into the breakup of the original lineup. So I still wonder if Dave quit for good in his mind, because I feel like he had to have assumed that the band would need him back by the end of the 80s. Like I feel like that was in the back of his mind. So he thought, I'm going to leave, do my thing, but what are they going to do without me? So let's just do my thing and I'll go back. I doubt I don't even know if he thought they would look for another singer. So yeah, what do you think about that? Do you think he really quit with the intention of quitting for good, or did you think he was coming back?
Yeah, there's a whole little chapter, because there's like 50 chapters, right? They're all milestones. There's a whole breakdown of that whole timeline of what went on there and the communication going back and forth and messing up. And it almost reminds me a little bit of this the Kendrick Lamar Drake beef that's going on, right? Where it's like misfirings of little insinuations and subliminal messages back and forth, and was that a dig, that kind of thing. And yeah, he obviously he had a massive ego, and he's going off and he's doing this goofy covers EP, which is pretty embarrassing. I don't think anybody liked it. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, getting Sammy in is such, that's who they got in. I mean, they at one point, I guess this is later, but they almost got a female singer in, right? Which
Patty Smythe.
Quite bizarre, right? Yeah. And I think they checked out somebody. Did they check out Sass Jordan?
Sass Jordan, you're right. Yeah.
But yeah, I don't know. It's such a weird thing getting this guy in that he was a mid-size. That's kind of the guy you would as a fan want to bring in. You want to bring someone in who's of a certain stature, and Sammy was, he's making platinum and gold albums at that point. He was a fair bit of a star, right? And he had certain pockets like St. Louis where he'd be a headliner in a hockey barn and stuff like that, right? So,
although he would tell you he was just as successful as Van Halen, he would tell you that.
Yeah, right.
That's what he was saying.
Yeah, and he'd say, his version of Van Halen, he'd be careful to cite the #1 albums and all that stuff, right? When conveniently forgetting that there's 2 diamond albums of the previous era, right? Yeah.
Yeah, that's all right. I love Sammy. I love both Dave and Sammy. So this is interesting. I just saw an article from Matthew Wilkening on Ultimate Classic Rock. Headline: Did David Lee Roth help write songs for Van Halen's 5150? And I pulled some of the article here because I find this really interesting, because I know Good Enough and Summer Nights were written for Dave, but they quote Dave from a 1993 Howard Stern interview where Dave says, quote, I wrote half of those melodies on 5150, the album. Half of those vocal moves and everything were already done on little demo tapes. What do you make of that? I've never heard anybody referred to as vocal moves, but that's only Dave could come up with something like that. But yeah, Is there
Very
something out there
interesting.
with Dave's vocals on it? You know, is it that would be amazing to listen to.
Well, first off, let's say that that album is notorious for having underwritten, undercooked songs. Like Good Enough is barely there. Best of Both Worlds is barely there. Summer Nights is pretty cool, but in some respects, it's barely there. There's barely any good lyrics. And there's not a lot of good vocal melodies. There's just a lot of Sammy jamming, vocal jamming, right? So whatever Dave said he wrote, and when he says I wrote those melodies, of course, he's definitely referring to vocal melodies, and it is not an album of ambitious vocal melodies as far as I can remember. I'm playing the songs in my head as we're talking here. And do you really think Sammy's going to come in and ape Dave's vocal melodies?
No.
Number one, like I say, they're barely there, and I don't think there were many because Dave is a wild man too. Dave and Sammy are both wild men. Or put it this way, Dave's more of a wild man when it comes to live, but on that album, Sammy's a wild man. Like he's just all over the place, just goofing around, right? So that really always did kind of bother me, and it bothered Eddie. It bothered the band, and I think it was part of the rift between those guys. It's like, Sam, come on, man, put in some hours, put in some work on this stuff, right?
Which he would do from time to time. You know, right now, songs like that he would
Yep.
do. There's just some, and then he had his moments where you're just thinking, well, yeah, how much time did you put into the lyrics? Yeah. Yeah. But a song like Good Enough, when that breakdown where Sammy's, hey, waitress, come here, man. That you could see was written for Dave. That's that breakdown part where Dave would do his spoken word thing, saying something funny, or, hey, I love the way the line goes up the back of your stockings. But that was the moment. I think that song to me is the most Dave.
Yeah, but I think that's in Sammy's nature too. And
Yeah.
Sammy is a smart guy too. He would have it in the back of his mind to act a little bit like Dave, right?
Yeah.
And he's coming into this situation. He's on top of the world, right? His solo career,
No pun intended.
any big, yeah. His solo career was in great shape at that
Right.
point. And I know that whole story because I ghost wrote with helped or interviewed and then basically wrote with Bill Church his biography, right? And I know that whole story of Farm Aid and what went down
Yeah.
there. So
Yeah.
crazy.
Yeah, I love those the 2 to 3 albums Sammy had out before joining Van Halen. Standing Hampton, VOA. I'm drawing a blank on Three Lock Box.
Three Lock Box is there.
Yeah.
Yeah. And they're very Three Lock Box and Standing Hampton are so similar to me in that they are absolutely in that Midwest rock, heavy John Mellencamp, heavy Bryan Adams sort of zone, right? There's no thinking like a heavy metal person there. It's just like, I'm going to walk a little on the wild side and inject a little guitar into these songs. But there's some great songs on there. And you hear that side of Sammy, that talented side of Sammy as a great heartland rock writer, right?
Amazing vocalist. Just to add a little bit more from that story from Matthew Wilkening, they also have a quote from Dave. This is from his book. It had been easier for them to put a new album together because I had worked with Edward on half of that album already. They brought in a new singer, went right to all those old tapes, and started with that as their go point. So it was much easier for them to reconstruct. All right, well, okay. I mean, I think about Oh You Ate One Too, and it does sound like an album where they start from scratch, right? I mean, those songs don't sound like anything that Ed had already pre-planned. Eat Thy Neighbor was another song. That's in the Van Halen Encyclopedia. They list Eat Thy Neighbor as an unfinished, unreleased original song. Let's see. It also notes that there's rumored to be an alternative version of 5150 Summer Nights with Roth written lyrics, and states that Eddie had just begun to write Dreams when Roth left the band. Yeah, okay, good. Yeah, here's what Hagar says in his book. They had what became Summer Nights and what became Good Enough. We started playing, and the engineer Don Landy recorded everything we did. I made up the first line on the spot, Summer Nights in my radio. It just popped into my head the first time I heard that riff. The rest of the song I just scattered my way through. He did the same with Good Enough. Well, yeah, maybe someday if they open those vaults. How many times have we said that? Maybe someday. I found it interesting in the chapter on 5150 from your book, Hitting Number One, the band's first album to go number one. You talk about how other bands from the old guard, like Kiss, Judas Priest, AC/DC, Scorpions, couldn't match the success of Van Halen with Sammy. So that leads to something I've been thinking about recently. Did Sammy come along at just the right time? I brought this up earlier. With the ballads, and the big power ballads, that Van Halen was huge with the power ballads. What do you think about Sammy joining when he did?
Yeah, so he's coming in as a superstar, but you're right. I mean, Dave wasn't going to write those kinds of songs. Maybe the band would have never come up with those kinds of songs, and Dave would have felt embarrassed writing them. But they had this new thing in their toolbox. It's almost like it's super hard to replace your singer, and often it doesn't work. But sometimes, the one silver lining of that with a big band is that it could be a really incredible story, right? So, Ronnie James Dio coming into Black Sabbath was a big story. People were excited about it, right? And so, yeah, he comes in. This is 3 years into the hair metal thing. It's starting to codify. There's starting to be more rules about it. MTV is even more powerful. MTV has been going for 5 years. The power ballad's a big thing. The big massive video is a big thing. So yeah, they dive in and do all that. Van Halen, when you compare them to all the 70s bands, they just came in. Everything they did was weird timing. It's just odd having the saviors of heavy metal show up in 1978 and basically a hair metal band show up in 1978, 5 years before hair metal, and they'll have 5 albums out before hair metal starts, right? Motley Crue even comes in a little early, right? So they're and they're American and they're from that town. So they're perfectly poised to do okay when this happens. But you're right. I guess I get it. I guess it is a case of perfect timing.
Yeah. Martin Popoff is the author of Van Halen at 50. You can grab a copy at the Van Halen store, vanhalenstore.com. Also, make sure you visit Martin's website, martinpopoff.com. Lots of good stuff there. One part of this book is one that'll get some debates fired up, and your rankings on the Van Halen album covers. And I was happy to see 5150 towards the top at number 3, because I've always loved that cover, although I've heard some people say they hated it. So I've heard people criticize that one. Nobody criticizes the 1984's album cover. That's a beauty. And that's your number 1. Tokyo Dome Live in Concert at the bottom. So I'm curious as to how you went about ranking these. Like, is it just an instant vibe thing? Are you looking for certain things in a good album cover that helps you come up with the ranking?
My God, yeah. Van Halen, I always, if someone says, oh, who makes the worst album covers, like instantly to mind pop bands like AC/DC, Def Leppard, Foreigner, Van Halen, right? And we know it's, I don't know if it's right from the beginning or whenever this started, but it became Alex's domain, basically. He's kind of running that show. Yeah, I just think in most cases they come up with pretty crappy album covers. There's a little humor there. And an odd way to look at it though is that you think of band names like The Police and The Cars, right? Horrible band names, but the legend that those bands spun became so big that you don't think of Cars or Police anymore. You think of, they take over the name kind of thing, right? So Van Halen album covers, they become iconic because how massively huge this band is. So, something weird like Van Halen 2 or Women and Children First with an inset little picture. And I never liked that picture because I think Eddie looks like he has mutton chops. He always reminded me of the guy from the Groundhogs, Tony McKee, on that album cover, right?
Yes. I got 2 framed, right? I got 5150 and 2 framed in my office here.
Yeah. And two just drove us nuts. You just look
just
at that,
the logo,
like,
yeah.
Like, what is this, right? So, but you think there's something about showing like star status or confidence, or we're not like other people. We can just do what we want. We don't have to do a fancy album cover. The music will speak for itself, kind of thing, right? But then you think, are they being visionary in that in future days? album covers will shrink to 5x5, and then they'll shrink to a little thumbnail on Spotify or whatever, right? So it turned out to be kind of a good idea to have these really simple album covers. But yeah, black and white photography, and but yeah, you think of Tokyo Dome Live. I can't remember the way I phrased it there, but it's like, what is the name of this album? Is it Van Halen Live Tokyo, Live Jam Tokyo, Live in Tokyo dash? Where
Here
do
we
you
go.
put the colon?
I got it right here.
Yeah, just read it.
The assembly of the parts looks like a 5-minute job by some kid with only a casual relationship with a PC's provided stock graphics program, and good luck giving the record a name. Its title buried somewhere within the consecutive reading, all caps and horrible of font, VH Live, Van Halen, Tokyo Dome, VH in concert. 16.
Yeah, really.
There it is. The very at the bottom, 16. What if they, here, my what ifs. What if they had like a Storm Thorgerson, did all those Pink Floyd album covers, or who's the guy who did all the Asia covers and
Roger Dean.
Roger
Yes.
Dean.
Yeah. That's a really interesting question, because I find to me, the biggest example of what I'm about to say is AC/DC Back in Black, where the music on that record is such a party, and yet the cover is so dour and dark and doomy, right? It's like the biggest incongruity between, what's on the record. So yeah, with Van Halen, you would probably, if they had meticulous, really cool, studied, expensive looking album covers, you would probably, consider the music enclosed slightly more ambitious as well.
Maybe add another 500,000 sales if they had.
It's a good point.
Because in those days, that's what would lead to you buying an album. A lot of times, that looks cool.
They say that, and it's a theory, and it makes sense. But we know so many amazing albums that have gone diamond and double diamond that had terrible album covers. So I wonder if in practice it really doesn't make much difference. Right.
Yeah. So OU812, you're a fan of that album, right? Mine All Mine is one you've talked about.
Yeah, I'm not a huge fan of that album. I love Mine All Mine. To me, that's a masterpiece. That's the best song on it. But the rest of it is still pretty lazy Van Halen. Okay. I think they really pick it up with For Unlawful Carnal Knowledge.
Okay, yeah. But I love that you love Mine All Mine, because I can't get enough of that song. And when they did it live on the Balance Tour, they did a great job with it on the big video screen, some surfer dude, because it is kind of like a surfer tune. And credit to Sammy on the lyrics. You got to give him that on the lyrics, right? But he admits on, I think it's was it If You Naturally Wired, or it was one of the songs where he regrets the lyrics. He just slapped them on there. It was like
Source of Infection.
Oh, Source of, that's the one, I think. Yeah. I think that's the one, but so he admits it.
There's and it's, again, they're still making fairly short albums. I think I can't remember how long it is, but it's not crazy long. It's not crazy heavy. It's it's very casual, but I think they, I always consider For Unlawful Carnal Knowledge. One of my podcast episodes was called Go to Vancouver and Try Harder. Where all the bands, like when grunge was coming in, it was really creative and cool and heavy. And it's like, wow, these guys are making some good music here. Most of the hair metal bands decided, like, we got to really step up and do a Dr. Feelgood or a Kiss Revenge, or Mr. Big albums, or Love Hate albums, or Use Your Illusion albums, where and Van Halen did kind of the same thing. There's not the Vancouver component in the way that Scorpions or Whitesnake or Bon Jovi, go Bruce Fairbairn and all that kind of stuff. But what they did is they made a long album, a heavy album, an ambitious album. Sammy's working hard on it. It's got huge bottom end. To me, it's not a Brown sound album particularly. I think it's more of a traditional conservative sober production, just a good quality muscular production job. But it loses some of the Who-like looseness and casualness of the last few albums.
I always say Judgment Day is my favorite deep track from that album. Here's a standout song for me, and right now is that, because it wasn't a huge hit when it was released on the radio, but then it's a heavy rotation on MTV, wins the award for best video. And all these years later, it gets more airplay than songs that were bigger hits then. Pound Cake, Top of the World, Run Around, right? Has that ever happened before or since? A video actually, the video itself helped to give the song, which wasn't a huge hit at the time, staying power. It's to this day now still played.
Yeah, that's the power of video, and this is Van Halen doing something socially conscious, which wasn't, you know, particularly associated with them. And you know, it's moving away from the standard hair metal tropes of you know, live performance, black and white, slow, throw your hair and the sweat flies, you know, reaching out to shake, you know, someone's hand in the crowd and all those things, right? It was just an artful video to an artful song. It was a daring, oddly arranged song. It was a ballad, but it was up tempo, but it was political. So that was really cool about it. But yeah, it's you know, video helped bands in various ways, and in this case, you know, there was a lot of talk about the video because it made the song even more socially conscious. It really galvanized, you know, underscored its identity as that.
Yeah, you do mention Dave's solo albums in the book, which I think it's a smart move because it is part of Van Halen history. It's like it's always in the discussion of Dave's solo work, especially those first two albums, Eat 'Em and Smile and Skyscraper. It's like Van Halen fans couldn't help but put it up against what Van Halen was doing with Sammy. It was yeah, what Dave's output there in the early years, solo work. Eat 'Em and Smile, you're a fan of. Skyscraper.
Yeah, I'm not a huge fan of either of them, but I love Hina off of the second one. And I love sort of the aesthetic of Skyscraper. You know, obviously what he was doing was very amusing because it was essentially Van Halen on cocaine or Van Halen on steroids, right? I mean, everything about it, the visuals, the speeds, the drummer, the guitarist, everything had it, you know, the bass player. He literally was saying, I'm gonna build a robot to replace each of these guys and bring them into this band, and we're gonna be the wild, you know, the wild $6 million man version of Van Halen, right? But no, I don't think it worked very well. He had the same problem as Van Halen did when it came to the OTT songs, the fast songs, and them not sounding heavy. No, I think all the way back to Ted Nugent, Light My Way on Free for All when I think of songs like that, right?
Yeah.
Or no, Turn It Up. Sorry, Turn It Up, not Light My Way.
Okay.
Turn it up, turn it up, turn it loud in hell. Did it. You know, it's a speed metal song, but it sounds like a pop song, right? And so Van Halen's heavy speed metal songs were like that too, and so were David Lee Roth. So, but I liked the aesthetic of the second one. The second one was so kind of airy and atmospheric and not heavy and up in that helium zone all the time. The you know, the gaps weren't filled in. It had no bottom end.
Yeah.
It was just a very weird. It had personality, and whereas the first one didn't have personality, it was like, yeah, I'm gonna make this commercial weird version of Van Halen.
Yeah, I'm a huge fan of Skyscraper. Huge fan, yeah. After that last album with Sammy, 95's Balance, obviously things were never the same. Van Halen 3 from 98, Gary Sharon didn't work. Yeah. The failed attempt at reuniting with Dave in 96, that came before Van Halen 3. Eddie diagnosed with cancer in 01, his substance abuse struggles get worse. A dark time, which led to that Sammy Hagar, David Lee Roth tour in 2002, and that's in your book. And the guys figured if Ed's not going to do anything, we will. And it's one of the 50 milestone moments in the book. While Dave went Van Halen heavy on the set list, Sammy didn't. He mixed in VH songs with his solo stuff, which I didn't think was a good move. What are your thoughts on that tour and Sammy's set list? You're not a big concert guy, I know that. But look, right. You got it from, you know, would you have put together that set list if you're Sammy on that particular tour?
That's Sammy, you know, marking his territory, saying, I'm a legitimate artist on my own. These songs are as big as the Van Halen songs, right? And the fact of the matter is, most of Dave's songs have more legendary status than the Sammy songs anyways. So you've got, you know, if you want to make a hierarchy, it's like Dave's songs are the iconic songs. Sam's songs are the next layer down, Sam's Van Halen songs. but then Sam has a pretty creditable lower tier, that third tier, that he can bring some of those songs into it. So it's basically him saying, I'm more than Van Halen. I'm the mature guy. I'm the adult in the room here. I have a career outside of this. I don't need to be doing this. Look, listen to my songs from my solo career, kind of thing. But yeah, that just played out the way that you thought it would play out, right? And it's two egos going up against each other, but Sammy's a sensible guy as well, right? So Sammy's got the ego, and he's also got the passive aggressiveness, right? And that's just fire thrown, that's just gasoline thrown on the flame of these two egos going up. And Dave's crazy, essentially, in terms of like his demands and his ego and the bodyguards and all that stuff. And then Sammy would take shots at that. Yeah, it's really funny, right? But
Sam knocking on the door. Diamond, he called him Diamond. Knocking on the door. Diamond, you coming out?
Funny, yeah. And then, of course, Dave probably would have done a better job had he had, more famous players in his band too, right? Like bring your iconic lineup from Eat 'Em and Smile or something, right?
You talk about the passive aggressive when they were coming through Connecticut, and the radio station I was working at, I was going to interview Sammy. I was like, yes. And I came in that morning, and program director says, Sammy's not doing it. And I thought he's pulling my leg. I said, get out of here. I mean, no, he's not. I said, why? And he said, the manager told me that Sammy's tired of Dave not doing any of the interviews, so he's going to stick it to Dave, and he's not going to do any more interviews. I'm like, oh, great, thanks.
Wow.
So I never got to talk to Sammy on that. That was that was towards the end. That was like right before. I think they were going to do the Connecticut. Would have been right, maybe only a handful of shows left at the time. Those two guys, man. Those two guys. Hey, I don't want to breeze over Van Halen 3 because I think it's fascinating that, and you were on John Lamoureux's podcast at least once, or if not twice or more. That's the Hustle podcast, and Mike Post was on, and he told John Lamoureux that, as far as it sounded, Mike Post was saying that Ed played all the drums on Van Halen 3, like that Alex was going through a difficult divorce, was drinking again. Eddie wasn't happy with Alex's performance, and he went to Mike Post and said, Mike, I don't know what to do here. I love Al. He's my brother, but he's not cutting it. And Mike Post said, don't worry, I'll take care of it. I don't know. Have you heard this? Do you want me?
I kind of forget the story.
Okay. Because he calls Al and he says, Al, let's meet. So he purposely meets Al outside, not inside. I don't know. I guess maybe he was afraid Alex would have bounced him off the walls if he told him you're not playing drums on this album. But he basically said that to Alex, like, look, this is your little brother. He's sober. He wants to make this album. This is his thing. Let him play drums. Right now, you're not cutting it. And Alex said, okay. That's pretty mind blowing. I don't think Mike plays any bass on that album. I think, you don't hear his backing vocals either. And Mike Post said, look, my job on that album, I was just there to oversee things. This was Ed's thing. Ed was, and he confirmed, Mike Post said that Mike went to Gary Sharon and said, sing it this way. I want you to sing this, sing it this way, sing it that way, do this, That's what everybody suspected, because it sounded like Gary was not really in his comfort zone there. It sounded like he was doing exactly what Eddie wanted him to do. Yep. So what do you think of that? Pretty wild.
Yeah, that's a situation where they bring in a singer exactly the same way that they brought in Sammy Hagar. You bring in somebody with stature already, who's respected in the industry, but it didn't work because number one, everybody's very cognizant of the East Coast versus West Coast vibe. Gary's a very different person. He doesn't really fit into that whole thing. He was already kind of a more thoughtful, intellectual type lyricist a little bit. Or at least as a person, he was that way. And you can definitely hear, we all heard when we heard that album, we thought, oh, he's sounding, he's trying to sound like Sammy by putting in a little more vocal fry into his voice and trying to act like the frat boy kind of thing a little bit, right? So yeah, it didn't seem like and this all happens because they're both managed by Ray Daniels out of Toronto, where I am, right?
Right.
that whole situation. So they're getting put together for that reason. So, I mean, it seemed like an exciting thing on paper, but yeah, I never liked this. You know, as deep fans, you do know, you want your band to seem like a gang. And you know, when you're grabbing a guy from a completely different country or continent and stuff, you know, they're not living together. And all that, you know, this is the lead singer. It's an important thing. You know, Ripper Owens coming into Priest. It's just like, oh, this guy's from Ohio. Like it bothers you, right? These moves, right? So yeah, it just never felt right.
Yeah, Mike Post, by the way, the producer of Van Halen 3, for
Yeah.
those who may not be aware, he was brought in because he wasn't a guy who drank and did drugs. So Eddie wanted him to produce because of that. He didn't want a guy who was going to influence him. It's interesting stuff from that interview. Sammy did come back in 04 for that tour that supported double best of with the 3 new songs, a couple you mentioned. But he was out soon after, and then we get Dave back for that 07 tour, Wolfie on bass. One of the milestone moments in the book, 2012 is A Different Kind of Truth. You call it, quote, the shocking last album. What's more shocking to you, the fact that they actually were able to complete it, or that it was so damn good?
Yeah, that was really shocking because you don't expect, you know, these guys are massive superstars. They've been that way for a long time. They've done a lot of music that wasn't particularly heavy over the years. They're from California. They've got a lot of people yapping in their ear. It's a lot of different people that don't, not a lot of people yapping in there. I guess they could put out whatever they want, I suppose. But, you know, guys pulling in different directions. You don't expect, there are some situations where this has happened where you got a really heavy album out of a band, but in this case, you didn't expect Eddie to be such a metalhead, right? You didn't expect him to be this much of a heavy guy, right? Even if Eddie was going to have, you know, complete control over the vision of it, there's no reason not to think it would be keyboardy and there'd be some pop and he'd do some experimentation. There'd be some atmospheric stuff like on 3. But no, we got a really headbanging album. And we got an album that was recorded like a heavy metal album. It wasn't particularly brown sound. It was enough brown sound, but it was heavy enough where the guitars were so up front and correct bottom end on the drums and all that stuff that it sounded a little conservative, right? Basically, you take the debut, you take For Unlawful Carnal Knowledge, you take Different Kind of Truth, though. I think those are the 3 most conservative albums they had from a production standpoint. So yeah, it was super heavy. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, am I surprised that they could get together and finish it? I don't know about that. I'm almost more surprised that these guys can't get together and get an album finished. It's like, what else do you got to do? There should be more music, you would think, right? But yeah, I was surprised how heavy it was. You know, I like it quite a lot. The bloom might have come off a little bit. I notice I've always liked it a lot more than a lot of people. There's a lot of people that don't like it a lot, which I'm surprised. I thought everybody would have loved it because it was just so heavy and uncompromising, right? But on a few of the songs, you can hear that they are from the 70s. What's Trouble, Big Trouble? Is that
That's a Trouble with Never?
Trouble with Never.
Yeah.
And there's another one.
I got the track listing in front of me here.
Can you go
by the way,
them? I'll tell you which ones.
And John Shanks, the producer, we should mention too. He's the one who produced it. Let's see, track listing: Tattoo, She's the Woman, You and Your Blues, Chinatown.
She's the Woman, definitely.
Okay, Chinatown, Blood and Fire, Bullet Head, As Is, Honey Baby Sweetie Doll, The Trouble with Never.
Yeah, Trouble with Never.
Out of Space, Stay Frosty, Big River, Beach
Big
Work.
River definitely sounds like it's old, right?
Yep.
So some of them sound like a little bit of that bar band from 75 or whatever. And then the other thing that is a little bit annoying about it is Dave is really over the top with his Dave-isms, right? He's like way into his shtick, his personality on here. Like he's just wisecracking, throwing out one-liners all over the place, right?
Look
so
at all the people here tonight. He puts into Blood and Fire.
Yeah. But yeah, I think it's there's a lot of explosive playing from Eddie and from Alex. A lot of great drumming on there as well. It's long, it's ambitious. There's a lot of surprising, interesting music on it, but it's all in a heavy zone, right? There's surprising heavy, creative music, but it's all heavy metal kind of thing. So that's pretty cool. That's pretty cool about it, that this would be the last album. It was totally unexpected.
Going to wind down with a question at each passing, but just first, I did get a chance to see this Behind the Music, MTV Behind the Music on Wolfgang. It's an emotional watch. Have you seen it?
No, I haven't seen it yet. I've heard good things about
it.
Yeah.
It answers a lot of questions as to something that you had mentioned, is how they couldn't get together, how they couldn't make things happen for so long, because after Van Halen 3, there was very little activity. And really the primary reason is Ed was getting deeper into his substance abuse problems to the point where he just didn't care. And it was Wolfie that really saved him. And it was Wolfie that brought him back out. We wouldn't even have had A Different Kind of Truth or those tours without Wolfgang. And Wolfgang addresses the fact that a lot of the Van Halen diehards were criticizing him, saying the only reason you got this job is because of your dad, and you're never going to be as good as your dad. On and on and on and on. He heard it. And his comment was, look, I get it. You guys wanted Mikey there. But my job was to keep my dad alive. That was the only reason that Eddie came back. And like Valerie Bertinelli says, she says, I have never seen another human being love another human being the way he loved Wolfgang. And you could see it. I mean, you could, like, you've been following Eddie for a long time. That smile on his face when he played guitar was real. But then, like, when he's with Wolfgang, it's a difference. It's like he was just glowing. It was like he actually saved him, because Eddie would have been gone. In 07, he said it went from alcohol to alcohol and drugs. Like, they were giving him drugs when he was in these rehab places. So he was combining the two. And now it was like, eyes are black, vacant. Nobody's behind there. You're like, who is this? And, he wasn't even, and Wolfgang gave him the ultimatum, like, enough of this bullshit. Like he said, Eddie was trashing the hotel room, and he just went in there. He's like, are you done? So can we talk now? This is ridiculous. Stop. And sure enough, Eddie came around because of Wolfgang. Went and got sober in like, what did he say? Maybe it was 07. Yeah, never looked back. I thought that it really is it's a tearjerker, man. At the end, he gets into the very last days and how he struggled. And I would recommend seeing it if you can. It's on MTV now. Yeah.
And I'll tell you that a crazy what if, I've never said this. I mean, I often, everybody, and I even said it to Wolfgang too. Everybody wants him to go into the tapes and build Frankenstein together a whole bunch more Van Halen albums.
They had footage of him in that documentary, and right behind him are all the tapes in 5150. Yeah. I was saying to somebody, I'm like, you see that wall behind there?
Yeah.
What's up there?
He obviously has his problems and riffs even with the Van Halen singers and stuff. But, you want to talk about a real what if. These bands that we were talking yesterday about, Blue Oyster Cult, and how Richie Castellano, yeah, could be the guy to take that band forward, because he like sings a third of the new album and writes most of the stuff. And
how is that new album, by the way?
It's great. Symbol Remains, not Ghost. That's the whole different thing. But Symbol Remains is a great, well received comeback album. But you could almost see Van Halen lasting for another 10 or 20 years with Wolfgang subtly coming in there and taking things over, and then becoming a lead singer one day, right? And all these, he's super talented. God, he's incredibly talented, right? Bass player, guitarist, writer, everything, singer. So obviously people want to drag him down or whatever, but he's the kind of guy that almost could have like carried the brand forward.
He could have.
I suppose he is anyways, but the singers, the voice is a part of the human body, and it's going to age, and we're going to lose Sammy and we're going to lose Dave. But over time, it's like, if someone was a manager was sitting there with the puppet strings, let's build the perfect band so Van Halen can go another 300 years. And how do we do that? Right. well, the first step is Wolfgang, and oh, here comes Mark Tremonti, at this point, or whatever, right? Or something happens, one by one they're replaced. Sammy's on an album, Sammy's on another album, then Sammy's gone, now Wolfgang's the singer, blah blah blah, right? So it's yeah, it's pretty interesting. And Alex maybe could have gone a little while longer too, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, final question, moment number 50, the book, Passing of King Edward, October 6, 2020. Mozart, Beethoven, around in the 1700s and 1800s, and people still talk about them today in high regard. It's hard for me to be objective on this. So I ask you, what do you think? What will people be saying about Edward Van Halen 100 years from now, 200 years from now? Was he this era's Mozart or Beethoven?
Absolutely. They will still be talking about them. They're still talking about them now. I think when it comes to guitar heroes, as time goes on and people are going, what's a guitar and what's a guitar hero and what was the 70s, 60s? No one can remember that far back. And as radio playlists get pared back further and further and further, I think already we're almost left with the only guitar heroes. There's two of them. There's Jimi Hendrix and Eddie Van Halen. It's the only two that are, on the list of two, put it that way. And I think he's going to always be remembered that way, because you can essentially, they got all these great songs, but all these great songs, there's all this amazing guitar in there as well. He's probably, I would say, yeah, actually, I've never really thought about this, but he might even be the guitarist with the most personality ever on the guitar. Because we know there's a lot of guitar players we love who we say don't have a sound at all. And then there's a lot of guitar players we love that are in the middle that have something of a sound. Like we know that part of their toolbox, and they do this and they do this, but often they're doing things that are sort of normal, or they're doing things that are rooted to a tradition. So, you got to be into guitar to realize what's cool about Michael Schenker or Randy Rhoads, or even Angus Young or Brian May, right? You got to be into guitar to hear it, right? And Jimi Hendrix is more of a guitar hero because of the story, right? But Eddie Van Halen, you hear a few of the different things in his toolbox, and it's like, oh, that's totally, you can be a layman and understand, and like he could be your entry into the idea of what is it like to be a guitar hero, or what is it like to study guitar or follow guitar. I never really thought about that before, but I think he might be literally the guitarist with the most personality coming through his fingers onto the guitar.
And I think the tool that he had, and I think that he would be happy to be remembered more as a songwriter than a guitarist per se. I think that he took pride in his songwriting, and the tool that he had was he could take, much of the Van Halen audience, I would say, are like myself, not a musician. When you can, of course, he was going to appeal to the musicians, the technical side of things, but the non-musicians could feel something as strongly as a musician could feel when they heard him play, is what I think speaks volumes to why they have so many fans.
Yeah, it's funny you bring up songwriter, because I have mixed feelings about that. Like, number one, sadly, the super deep fan almost thinks of him more as a guy with a soldering iron more than anything, right? Like working on his bench, just jamming, recording things we're never going to hear. So they didn't put out enough music, number one. But the neat thing about being a songwriter in Van Halen, or the idea of songwriting and Van Halen, is that songs fell out of that because they weren't so steadfast a song like, okay, this song is built around this riff, right? It's built around guitar chatter and guitar bubbliness and guitar chords and guitars drifting in and out of the riff, the way people sometimes complain a little bit about Ritchie Blackmore, right? So that's the neat thing. Basically, guitars, they're doing a whole pile of things, but there's a large amount of serving the song that goes on even in the guitar. So he's a jack of all trades on that thing, right? But yeah, you do not think of this band and start rattling off all the great Eddie Van Halen riffs of all time. You just think of him as just this total musician, a true Mozart, a true creative force. This is my tool, and I'm going to use it in a lot of crazy, innovative, interesting ways. And just one of the things I'm going to do is you're going to hear some riffs.
Van Halen at 50. You could get it at the Van Halen store, vanhalenstore.com. Release date is May the 28th. And by the time we put this episode up, it should be out by now. Also, martinpopoff.com. So, yeah, Martin, what can we find on your website along with Van Halen at 50?
Well, I've done 120 books, and I'd say 100 of them are in print, or 90 of them. And the other recent ones, I've been doing these panel books, assemble panels of experts and go through every studio album. So we've got a recent one on Robert Plant, a recent one on Thin Lizzy. I got the Led Zeppelin, a visual biography, is new as well. So we've been doing a lot of those timeline.
I saw that
hardcover books.
That's a new one, the Zeppelin visual biography.
Yeah, okay. That's new as well. Queen Live is coming. That's a timeline with quotes, but more based on the live experience. And yeah, AC/DC, if you like this format and the beautiful layouts that this company does, my AC/DC at 50 and my Kiss at 50 are really similar.
And I believe that your Van Halen visual biography, which was out, here it is. You can get Van Halen visual biography is now at the Van Halen store. People can grab a copy there, the hardcover, which came out 2-3 years ago originally. And I remember we talked about that book 2-3 years ago. Yeah, very cool. All right, Martin, thanks. As always, thank you for the great work that you do. And we're looking forward to having you back on for another one of your many amazing books.
Wicked. Love talking with you.